Hello, my name's Chris Nicholson. I'd like to introduce you to the Open Seminar Series for the Centre for Psychoanalytic Studies. The seminars themselves have been taking place for about 15 years since the centre itself was founded by Professor Carl Filio and David Miller. Topics for the Open Seminar Series are quite wide-ranging. Often they're concerning both academic and clinical matters. Often these are clinicians trying to think academically or academics trying to think clinically about their work. They cover a range of areas such as social care, health and education. And our speakers for the Open Seminar Series come from within the centre itself, from other departments within the university, but also we draw in speakers of both national and international acclaim. One of the things that's really useful about the Open Seminar Series is that because psychoanalysis is really an applied discipline, we are particularly popular with local professionals who work in health, education and social care, and therefore the Open Seminar Series is really quite a thriving little community. Joseph Aguirre-Odo, who's a training and supervising psychoanalyst at the Psychoanalytic Center in California. And he holds doctorates in both clinical psychology and modern European history from UCLA. He's a recipient of the International Psychoanalytic Association Research Advisory Board Fellowships. He combines his clinical and research interests by specializing in the history of Kleinian psychoanalysis. And there are a number of papers that he's published. These generally appear in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. And he's certainly currently completing a book, but he's actually just completed it, which is entitled Klein and Beyond, Contemporaries and Successors in London, 1914 to the Present. And the paper that he's going to be giving today represents the fourth chapter from this monograph. So that book looks like it will be out sometime around April. Okay, so you can look forward to that, and you're lucky because you're right in at the beginning of this exciting set of ideas. So if we're ready, Kevin, is that ready? Yep. Okay. So the title of the paper is Historicizing Melanie Klein's Concept of Projective Identification, 1946 to 1957. So, Joseph.
Thank you.
Should we give them a nice warm welcome?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to Debbie Stewart for facilitating our visit here, and to Bob and Jillian Hinchelwood also for making this possible. We come from a much warmer place, so my hat's off to all of you for being able to bear this climate. We just were talking with Bob and Jillian and said that it was freezing here, and they said, no, not quite. So for us, this is freezing. In California. You know, I was thinking last night, because I understand that this is a mixed audience, undergraduates, graduates, people have had interest in psychoanalysis, Jungian analysis. I have genealogy in all three, so I'll just say a little bit something about my background. I started my career having a few years of Jungian analysis, and then had a Freudian analysis, and then culminated with a Kleinian one, so I speak all three dialects. So please feel free to talk to me in any one of those dialects as you choose. You know, last night I was thinking about how I could pitch this because I knew it was going to be a mixed audience, and the image of the Janus-faced figure occurred to me because if I had to pick one centrally important paper that Melanie Klein ever wrote, it would be the paper that I'm going to be speaking about tonight, the Notes on some Schizoid Mechanisms, which she wrote in 1946. And if I think about, well, what does it say about her career from the time, let's say, the First World War until the end of the Second World War? Of course, we know that she was famous for her innovations in play therapy, that Freud had this idea that you could only talk to latency-aged children. If you think of the little Hans case, he did the supervision through the father, but it was all talking therapy. And one of the things that I think so crystallizes that period where the initial interest in child analysis was starting was when the Budapest analyst Sándor Ferenczi attempted to replicate Freud's study in 1915 of the little Hans case with a little case he called the little Chanticleer. It was a boy who went out behind the family home, was urinating in a hen coop, and then he had his penis pecked by a rooster, was traumatized, it drove him into analysis, and Ferenczi was attempting to talk to him about his problem because he thought he had a real live case. And so, as he was talking to the boy, he said, the boy wandered over to his desk, and as it turned out, there was a little rooster figurine just by chance on Ferencz's desk. And the boy picked it up and started playing with it. And Ferenczi said, well, the hour was over at that point because he was only interested in playing. And so that really pretty dramatically gives you an idea of how the classically trained analyst at that point had no way to factor in play with toys as any kind of meaningful communication. So there were obviously other people besides Klein, but Klein obviously is most famously known for innovating the play technique where the boundaries of analysis could be extended now into the earlier years, because if you made that assumption, that which is commonplace today for any child therapist, that if you watch a child play with small toys and figurines, you're seeing something of the exteriorization of the child's psychic life represented in the toys. And so Klein thought, oh my gosh, we've now been able to extend the boundaries of analysis. Now we can start to do child analysis, which he proceeded to do in the 1920s. And there was this way that was established of being able to communicate as well as receive communications from children. And if I think in an overall sort of panning back historical way about what the significance of Klein's innovations in psychoanalysis, I think it was an attempt to make intelligible those outliers in the human family. And children were certainly seen as outliers in one respect at the time because they were to be seen and not heard, but they actually did have minds. They were minded. They could make themselves known. They had this way of communicating, but it was also now wonderful that there was this additional software that we had accumulated that made it possible for us to understand the communication of children. Now, she also came under the very powerful influence of an analyst in Berlin, Karl Abraham, who was a very devoted disciple of Freud and always was interested in looking at those aspects of Freud's theory that he thought were incomplete. And because he had trained as a psychiatrist at the Buchholz in Zurich, he thought that perhaps the earliest fixations that a person could experience might be related to the development of psychosis. So he had this very simple idea he took from Freud that the earlier the fixation would take place in the oral and the anal phase, that might tell us something about how psychotics developed. Now, Klein picked that idea up, having been in supervision and then an analysis with Abraham in the middle 1920s in Berlin. And she very much always kept in mind the idea that at some point we might be able to, as she was developing the software to talk with children and receive their communications, that at points later on we might be able to also then understand the very, very complex ways in which psychotics attempt to make themselves known. Now, Freud, as we all know, didn't really concern himself that much with psychosis. I mean, aside from the Schreber case, he really didn't write all that much about it. But it's a curious thing that when he did write about the mad jurist in northern Germany, Dr. Schreber, that one of the things he did do was he analyzed his memoirs and was able to make what he thought was intelligible psychoanalytic sense out of what he thought was a paranoid delusional psychosis that Dr. Schreber manifested, but at the same time said, because what he called a group of narcissistic neuroses, the people that are psychotic, are intensely fixated to themselves. In other words, they're only attached to themselves, they don't attach to others. They wouldn't form what he thought of as a treatable transference. So if you can't attach to the figure of the doctor, there's no analysis possible. Now, this was, I think, more or less of a theoretically driven assumption that Freud made, and this is something that I think Abraham certainly had some questions about. And certainly I think he inspired Klein to think about, well, maybe at some point we might be able to also communicate beyond children. We could communicate with psychotics. We could understand what they would have to say. And very early on in her career, in 1930, I think with a child that would today be thought of as autistic, she did attempt to try and make some sort of communicative links with the child. So I think that this is one way that I can pan back from this paper in 1946 to say, what was the general trajectory that Klein was working on? Communication with children, communication with psychotics. By the time this paper is written in 1946, a lot of things have happened. She's become a training analyst at the British Society. She's emigrated from Berlin because once Karl Abraham died in 1925, she really didn't have a mentor and a supporter. And one of the most startling things about her career trajectory is no university education, the mother of 3 children, and she makes her way to the center of a patriarchally dominated psychoanalytic movement by the late 1920s, and her fame only grows when she moves to London. She becomes a training analyst. She starts having other people in training with her, goes through a monumental struggle with Anna Freud, which is another chapter of my book, in which, you know, here's Anna Freud, who has the Freud name, getting into the family business, also pretty much from the same background as Klein in terms of no university education. But she had some quibbles with what Klein was proposing in terms of her method of child therapy. One of the things that she questioned was the idea of attributing these incredible symbolic interpretations to children. Like if the mother turned the purse upside down and coins came out, she said, oh, Klein thinks that of babies falling out of mother's womb. How preposterous is that? She thought of it as a bit of wild analysis. Anyway, it happened to really be very fortuitous for Klein that this happened, because here you have Anna Freud critiquing Melanie Klein in her first book on child analysis, and Klein, who's in London by this point in 1926, 1927, is being mentored and also has a very powerful patron in Ernest Jones. And Ernest Jones, who has all the English rights to Freud's publications, also running the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, decides this is the moment to really put the English Institute on the map. Because up until this point, I think that the London Institute had been pretty much a backwater. If anyone wanted a proper analysis, they either went to Berlin or they went to Vienna. So Jones sees an opportunity by mentoring and also supporting Klein to say, oh, let's put something into print here that will defend Klein's perspective on child analysis, so this is what really starts to put her on the map. And so they would quibble, as they say, from Vienna to London over the next decade or so, until the Freud family had to move under the pressure of the Nazi takeover of Vienna to London. And when the Freud family came to London, all of a sudden you have Anna Freud and Melanie Klein under the same roof. This leads to another very important period, which we won't have time to talk about too much tonight, the controversial discussions from 1941 to 44, in which the contrary views of these two analysts were really pitted against each other. And in a typically British compromise method, at the end of this flurry, the British Society decided that they couldn't really adjudicate the truth of which clinical theory was to be preferred over the other. So we had three training tracks that emerged in 1945 in the British Society. The Klein track, the Anna Freud track, and then the non-aligned or middle group, the Winnicotts and the Bowlbys of the world, that became this group that decided to choose and select what they wanted from each theory. So that's the point that we're at this particular juncture. Now, just sort of fast forward to, well, where does this paper take us in terms of the future? I think because she tries to analyze and also map out what's going to be involved in approximating what psychotic states of mind are, that's basically going to set the table for the Klein movement for the next 15 years. And after the psychiatric medication revolution in the 70s and 80s, where by and large most analysts don't see psychotic patients anymore, it also set the table for the analysis of narcissism, which is still alive and well with us today. So by understanding something about psychotic states of mind, the Kleinians thought that this gave us a way to understand something about narcissistic expression, because let's recall that Freud originally grouped these particular diagnoses under what he called narcissistic neuroses, people that are internal, self-fixated. He grouped together like the perversions, narcissism, and psychosis. So that gives you an idea of why this particular paper, if I had to recommend one paper, is the central, and it's probably the most difficult of all of Klein's papers to understand. Let me get into a little bit about what that's about tonight. In 1946, when she wrote this paper, she could say that she had really attained a position of institutional importance. She has her own training track, she has her own analysans, and she was very fortunate insofar that she was such a magnetic, charismatic person that she attracted three particular people to the movement. This is Wilfred Bion, Hannah Siegel, and Herbert Rosenfeld, all three trained as psychiatrists, and in the post-war era happened to be analysans of Mrs. Klein's. So she said in the paper, I would be most appreciative if someone could come forth and test out some of these ideas that I'm going to put forth in this paper, subjected to psychiatric observation, And that's exactly what this group did. For whatever else you might say about the Klein group in London, they were capable of marshaling and organizing very, very effectively. And I think this is the first sign. As a matter of fact, at this point in time, they're not called Kleinian, they're called Kleinists, which is a term slightly pejorative that Winnicott originated because he thought that everyone should be more like him and just be an individual and have their own theory. So these three particular analysts organized underneath the Kleinian banner, and she writes this paper on schizoid mechanisms, and in that paper they took up her programmatic agenda. Now, one of the things that's very central in that paper, that's central to this day, and that's why I say the paper really is Janet's face. It tells you something about the past in terms of her analysis of children, the incorporation of that idea in terms of analyzing infantile states of mind, which she thought is very clearly linked to psychotic states of mind, because she had this developmental schema that basically said it was an assumption that infants and psychotics traverse the same developmental positions early on in life. The problem for the psychotic is that's where he more or less stays, whereas children outgrow that. But there's always that potential to regress back to that infantile core part of the personality. So that's one of the things that she was looking to now extend by now saying, let's see if we can delineate what psychotic states of mind are. And this is what the three analysts under the Kleinian banner took up. Now, she made some rudimentary definitions of projective identification in the 1946 paper. I'm sure most of you have heard the ideas that are in that very, very complex notion of projective identification. Entire papers and books are still being written about this topic, and depending on who you read, this is one of those concepts in psychology that has infinite elasticity. I mean, depending on who you read, you can read a different version of projective identification. As a matter of fact, I corresponded with someone from University of Graham Clark who is very interested in Fairbairn, and asked me, well, you know, in the elucidation of the paranoid and schizoid position, you know, she did borrow from Fairbairn. Isn't there more that could be said about it? Well, I think the long and the short of it is because it's such a robust concept, a lot of different people have tried to claim it. People have written histories about it. But I'm just going to give you the immediate short history of it tonight. In other words, what Klein said in her 1946 paper, which had to do with not even really formally defining projective identification, but she talked about, and again, this is from an infantile state of mind, harmful excrements projected by the infant into the mother, things that you don't want about yourself. And again, this follows Abraham's notion of the gastrointestinal model, that we rid ourselves of waste, which we don't want. We rid ourselves of wasteful things in terms of anal projections. We put it onto somebody. Infant projects it onto the mother. And then, of course, attempts to have some sort of separateness from the mother in terms of not either wanting to be phobically attacked or persecuted by the mother, or have some sense that he can control the mother by some sort of anal mechanism. But they were aspects of the self that were disowned by the subject and felt to be part of the mother. So the mother now becomes the bad, analyzed self. It's also a prototype of aggressive object relations, because obviously there's a lot of aggression involved in these sort of hostile projections. But I would also want to remind us that at this time, she was talking about something that was really much more of a conceptual idea, and what she needed was someone to come along, because she had only had the one case study that I told you in 1930. She had really not had much on-the-ground experience analyzing psychotic states of mind. This was more of a theoretical expectation that this was possible, and it was very handy for her that she had three very, very brilliant psychiatrists in her practice that were willing to test these ideas out. So the first one that I want to talk about is Herbert Rosenfeld. Rosenfeld, a German Jewish immigrant, came and had an analysis with Klein, and had been very interested even before he met Klein in the treatment of psychosis in schizoid patients, wanted to see if they could be treated with psychoanalysis. And again, you have to know that right there and then you already have someone going against the Freudian canon. Because if you're listening to what Freud has to say, he says psychotics really aren't analyzable. So we really would best leave them off to have someone else deal with them. But Rosenfeld thought this was a challenging idea to see if that could be done, if there was some way we could understand and elucidate what psychotic mechanisms were all about, based on this understanding that Klein was evolving about the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position. So one of the first ideas that he postulated from one of the patients that he saw was the notion that he called the massive confusion of self and other. One of the things that he says psychotic people tend to do as a main course is to confuse their self-experience with the experience of others. So now he starts to begin to contrast the experiences that he's having clinically with what Klein has postulated in her notion of projective identification, where you're trying to get rid of the bad aspects of self, you project it onto the mother or the analyst, and then you take some distance from it. He said that he thought that psychotics were so much more profoundly confused that they couldn't actually attain that developmental accomplishment. In other words, to get rid of the bad stuff, put it onto somebody else, and then take some distance from it. He said a lot of times it happened the other way around, that the psychotic would remain identified with the bad aspects of self, and then the analyst or the mother would wind up being identified with something that was good. At any rate, it was a notion of profound confusion of self and other, which fits very, very seamlessly, I think, with this notion of psychotic transference. And so again, these are people that are really pioneering in an area that really hadn't been discussed that much by Freud, in which he basically said, if you look at Freud's notion of transference, one of the things that's always present in the transference situation is that as the patient, you can always have the feeling that there is something that you're not wanting to own about yourself that you've now projected onto the analyst. There's an as-if quality to it where you're saying, well, it is me, but it feels like you, and that's really what we're here to sort out. But you have the capacity developmentally to sort those things out. You have that sense that you're in a kind of dramatic play, and those things can be sorted out. Now, Rosenfeld said, by contrast, the psychotic patient can't do that. They can't sort out what belongs to them, what belongs to the analyst, and so there's a confusion, who's aggressing on whom. And in one of his first case studies, a very famous case study he wrote in 1947, the case of Mildred, he thought exemplified exactly that kind of notion. She thought of Rosenfeld, who was the analyst, as the devil trying to force himself into her mind so that he could muddle things up. So needless to say, the idea of having a person in that kind of state of mind attempt to own that she was projecting onto him was patently impossible. She would have understood it as just merely his way of further aggressing upon her. So he had to tolerate that idea that she saw him as the devil trying to force his way into her mind to muddle things up. But this was a first attempt to actually give some additional clinical meaning to the notion of projective identification. And so he talked about it as a notion that occurred in a pre-splitting kind of way. In other words, where you have the normal infant that can project bad excrements and then remain identified with something good, you have something the other way around in this period of early disintegration and confusion. So the patient would be habitually identified with something that would feel bad and self-persecuting. So that's the case of Mildred. Needless to say, the analyst can't remain the one who's confused in that situation. So one of the things that was really a premium in that situation was the analyst was the one that was identified as the person that made the discriminating perceptions in the situations, that knew how to sort things out and keep things straight. So that's a little bit about Rosenfeld. The idea of forcefulness is attributed to Rosenfeld, and he is the only one between the period of the first paper on schizoid mechanisms in 1946 and 1952 where Klein then issues a revised version of the paper, and she really didn't revise her papers all that much, so I think it's always significant. And this is now me talking as a historian, because among other things, one of the things I'm very interested in is tracking textual shifts. So no matter what theorist you may be interested in, don't read what you read in a collection of essays about Jung or Ferenczi or anybody else you're interested in. Always go back to the original and see if in fact any additions have been changed or altered, because more often than not you'll find things in the first original journal appearance of an article than the way it will look later on. But certainly I think it's true about Klein's revision of schizoid mechanisms, because by the time she reissues it in 1952, paranoid and schizoid, which we always think of as together, actually were quite separate in the first article. She joins the ideas of paranoid and schizoid together, and now she's much more confident about saying, here's a formal definition of projective identification, and has this idea of forcing oneself into the object. And when she has this definition in the 1952 paper, she has a little footnote where she cites Rosenfeld's work, which I think is pretty good evidence that she actually got those notions of forcing oneself into the object from Rosenfeld. So by 1952, there's a more formal definition of projective identification, and at this point, a second contributor becomes involved. And again, I'm taking them up in sequence. So very clearly, it was Rosenfeld and Rosenfeld alone who made any attempt to deal with projective identification between 1947 and 1952. Then Hannah Siegel becomes involved and gets interested in the whole notion of symbolization. Now, symbolization also has a very long history in psychoanalysis. If you go back to the Dream Book, the whole notion of symbolization, if you use the topographic theory, is a compromise between what's unconscious that's trying to emerge. You have instinctual urges that are trying to reach the light of day. Then you have whatever the censoring mechanisms are that act on those impulses. And then they form the compromise, which is the manifest dream as we remember it. And in those manifest dreams, we often find symbols. So the whole notion of symbolization, according to the topographic model of Freud, was the notion that it served a defensive function. Now, there were various elaborations of it, and again, back to Ferenczi, who made that attempt to analyze the young Chanticleer. Ferenczi had the idea of what he called symbolic equations, where he said that you could equate, the child would equate certain organs with external objects. So Klein picks up this notion of symbolic equations and develops it in the case that I mentioned just briefly, where she was looking at this autistic boy who refused to play with toys. And so one of the things that she started to do, which is very uncharacteristic of her, is that she would suggest certain scenarios to him, which he eventually wound up taking up. But there was obviously, as you would expect with an autistic child, extreme constriction in terms of wanting to use the play space to express himself. Hannah Siegel picks this up and starts to notice that in certain cases that she tries to treat of psychotic patients, that psychotic patients have a tendency to make what she would have thought of, and we would think of naturally, as false equations between certain objects and what the objects represented. So for instance, there was a patient that she saw that she claims was the first patient to be seen in analysis in England, the case of Edward, in which he had been in carpentry class and he made a stool. And she thought, well, it might be nice to talk about that with him. And when she did, he got very, very embarrassed, because in his mind, in the psychotic state of mind that he was in, the idea of making a stool was shitting himself. So it became a source of tremendous embarrassment. And that was what started getting her attention more and more, this kind of false equation that the psychotic would make between things and the things that they were attempting to represent. So she said, well, we have to play that in. We have to understand. And again, it is the language of symbolism that we deploy in dreams as normal neurotics. But the psychotic is particularly fixated in the idea of equating things with what they represent. So there's another very important idea. She said it was profoundly difficult to talk with Edward about any sense of feeling castrated. I mean, we might use that as therapists as a metaphor for feeling ineffectual or feeling powerless or feeling helpless. But again, when he heard her say the word, he was thinking he was literally castrated. So then again, it became a source of tremendous inhibition, and they weren't able to talk. Anyway, she thought that this idea could help us again understand what it meant to have the experience of being in a psychotic state of mind. One trajectory that I think the Kleinians are very interested in accessing at this time is, what does it mean to be in a psychotic state of mind? And one way you can look at it, if you like experimental psychology, is that they were trying to elucidate what they thought these central key mechanisms were, while at the same time, in effect, freezing any kind of notion of the environment. So when you see them trying to deal with any notion of environmental impact, which obviously is important in the development of schizophrenia, people that were writing about this in America, like Frieda von Reichmann, the notion of the schizophrenogenic mother, there are types of mothers that induce psychosis. That was something that the Kleinians pretty much didn't want to deal with at the time, because they felt that they were dealing with the primary order, and the primary order is to try and approximate and understand what a psychotic state of mind was. So that's a little bit about Hans Siegel. The last, and I think probably the most difficult person to talk about, is Wilfred Bion, who had the good fortune to come in right at this juncture where Rosenfeld had made his original elaborations of projective identification. Klein now has the formal definition in the 1952 revised paper. Hannes Siegel has written about symbolic equations, and basically, you know, Bion arrives the right man at the right place at the right time, also an analysis with Klein, and basically shuffles all the cards together and starts producing new combinations of ideas. Now, I think that I think stereotypically, Bion is the one that's probably known as the one that has the most opaque, difficult to understand ideas. And I can remember being a candidate at our institute, which is the only British object relations oriented institute in the United States back in the early 90s. When I went to my first Bion seminar, I just absolutely couldn't understand heads or tails of what it was he was writing about. But I noticed in the Introduction to Second Thoughts, which was a collection of his essays from 1967, he said that I like to write in plain expository English. And then you flip open, I just flipped open randomly to an open passage, and there was a Euclidean theorem in geometric speak, a quotation in Latin, and some obscure play from Shakespeare, all in one paragraph. And I thought, this doesn't sound like clear English to me. I raised it to the seminar leader, who got very annoyed and said, well, it's pretty plain and pretty direct to me, but you know, so it goes. And I found myself actually quite put off by Bion for a number of years before I was able to actually come back to it and appreciate it by beginning at the beginning. And I think that's a wonderful place to start. His early papers on readerless groups and experiences in groups, I mean, it's just so fundamentally key to what the experience of group therapy is like, and comes up with some very innovative ideas that are a little bit easier, I think, to enter into before you get into the period that we're going to talk about, which is his papers on psychosis. Because with Bion, you have a number of different interesting confluences. One thing that I've noticed in my own research, because again, I like to track texts in the beginning and see how they develop over time, he too has a paper on group dynamics, which he revises. He wrote it in 52, and then he revises it again in 55, and there's a number of shifts that are going on in that time period. But one of the things that he takes up is something that becomes absolutely central, and still is central today to the Kleinian development, which is the notion of the communicative impact of projective identification. So let me just contrast very briefly and very in a kind of caricatured form of what Klein's definition of projective identification was, because she says it's an unconscious fantasy. Remember, we're talking about unwanted excrement and projected out. So it's an unconscious fantasy that you're trying to rid yourself of. And in that kind of intrapsychic model, the analyst is kind of an objective decoder of what the fantasy's meaning is. So this is sort of like a caricature of Freud, you know, the objective neutral analyst who's supposed to decipher the meaning of the particular unconscious fantasy is just going to do that. Now, in Bion's elaboration of it, he said that he actually thought that, yes, that part was true. It was a necessary element in the definition of projective identification, but he also added this other aspect of it, which was it also has, listening to certain fantasies can have an impact on you as the analyst listening to them. So he started thinking about the communicative impact. Now, I think he was obviously moved in this direction because he was dealing with psychotic patients. If you've ever talked to anyone who's psychotic, it's quite jarring. I mean, it immediately puts you into a world that you don't really have much escape from because it's sort of forced on you. And one of the things that he was very taken by was the violence. And again, think of Rosenfeld's idea of the analyst forcing himself into the mind of the patient so he could confuse her. So the idea of forceful projection would have an organizing impact on the analyst. And so this is something he became very interested in. One of the very key ideas he also evolved as he was doing these analyses of psychotic patients was the whole notion that the psychotic attacks his own mind. Okay? So the notion that there's such a hatred of reality that you wind up attacking your own perceptual apparatus is something that's very key to Bion's ideas at that time. Now again, as the analyst in that situation, you're the one that has then, you're the repository of being able to make sound discriminations, being able to keep things straight, being able to help people sort things out. And sometimes, obviously, that would arouse envious attacks on the patient's side because, you know, there they see you plodding along, being sane and doing all the things that they can't do. So obviously you thought that that would stir up a tremendous amount of envy. So here you have some ideas that the Kleinians have come up with. You have Rosenfeld's massive confusion of self and other. You have Anna Siegel's notion of symbolic equations. And now you have Bion's notion of the attacks on one's mind, and then forcefully attacking the analyst in the communicative way so that that has an organizing impact on the analyst. So I think these folks were so involved in trying to evolve these notions that they really didn't have much time to think about, well, are we going to evolve some sort of systematic way of treating psychotic patients? I think they were just too much in the throes of what was going on. Reminds me of what someone asked Talleyrand once, why didn't you keep memoirs while the French Revolution was going on? He said, well, we were too busy living it to have time to sit down and write about it. And I think these folks were in the same situation. They were very much involved in the analysis of psychosis, and the whole idea of systematizing any kind of treatment regimen would have to wait until later on. But as far as treatment was concerned, Klein had some notions at that time about what were important things, and all of them were, of course, interested in developing these notions. Of course, there's the notion of transference psychosis, which completely goes along with the idea of the confusion of self and other. And they also, as I said before, tried to focus primarily on the internal psychological situation of the patient. The role of the environment really would remain secondary during this time, ignored, as were some of the writings of the Americans on this question at that point. So what they tried to do was to see if they could make some kind of contact link with the patient. So obviously, with the notions we've talked about already, that gives us a sense of what our software is going to be. And so to make any patient feel that you've understood what they're saying, you have to be able to at least subjectively, empathically be able to play it back to them in a way that they would find convincing, like, yeah, I think this man actually does understand what I'm trying to say. And so they did that. I also mentioned that they were very, very persuaded. As a matter of fact, Bob Henschel has written a paper on Klein and countertransference, which shows that Klein, even though she didn't subscribe to this notion of the communicative impact in any kind of formal way in her published writings, had some sense from her supervisions with these folks and others that certainly there was something very, very jarring and mind-splitting about being in a room with a psychotic person, so that it could have an organizing impact. But in her official theory, she described countertransference as basically something that was the personal interference. This is whatever unresolved problems you have that Freud talked about, that interfere with your capacity to be an objective ego observer to the patient's situation. So I think that Bion certainly was the one, I think, that was single-handedly the most important in terms of understanding this profoundly organizing impact that the communicative aspect of the countertransference had. And so, as he said, how is it that I became a player in your interior fantasy? How is it that I've just been swooped into your psychic playing field so that I am now felt to be a part of your psychic interior? Now, If the person you're talking to can't discriminate between inside and outside, that kind of thing can happen very, very easily. So there was that sense that I think he was very, very singularly important to establishing the Kleinian notion of the wider communicative aspect of countertransference. Also, there was the aspects of the way in which the patient's early history was dealt with. And again, you get differences, and I think it's always interesting to compare the cohort that you're looking at, like these three were in the same group, the same analyst, and they all had a slightly different view of the importance of the patient's early history. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with a psychotic person, you're going to have profound difficulties with memory. That's the least of your worries. And so, in general, I think Hannah Siegel was much more like Melanie Klein, where she would try and take some aspect, if there was an aspect of the recoverable, of something the patient might remember about the early experiences they had, and try to make, in the Freudian sort of way, a past to present link with something that would happen in the transference. So for instance, if we just take the example of Edward, who had the issue of having made the stool, obviously you're going to be spending time talking to a patient like that about being able to accept that in his mind, in that symbolic equation way, he's just made a big fecal mess in your consulting room, and you're going to have to deal with his shame and his sense of embarrassment and all the rest of it before you might even get around to thinking about what messes are there from the past that might be linked to this current state of affairs that he's dealing in the transference with you now. But presumably, if you could do that kind of work, get beyond the inhibition, be able to work it through in an interpretive way, you then might be able to make links from the past to the present. Rosenfeld was a little bit more exacting about his reconstructive work. At one point with the patient that I was talking about, that he was discussing in terms of the sense that she had that he was the devil trying to force his way into her mind, he said that he had reconstructed that she had had a brother born when she was 19 months of age. And he said, isn't it interesting that it occurred in the 19th month of analysis? So there's a kind of a dramatic exactness about the way in which he's trying to pinpoint things back in the past. And he's a little bit more Freudian in that respect of trying to make more precise links between the past and the present. Now, all this sort of, again, sets the stage for Bion, and this is in the early 1950s, where when you look at Bion's first case, his membership paper for the British Society, fascinating. Now, there's a paper you could just read without having any Bion that is just such a fascinating read. It's called The Imaginary Twin. It's in a collection of essays called Second Thoughts. In that particular case, he was seeing a middle-class school teacher who went on and on for a couple of years about all sorts of events, and Bion was taking notes, making interpretations, and he said, there was just something that was very fetid, very stale about the analysis. He thought that, the patients seemed to be making reasonable progress outside the analysis, but he felt that there was something very, very stale and dead-like in the analysis itself. And then through a series of dreams, he made this profound discovery that much of what he had thought the patient had been describing as physical, real occurrences outside the consulting room were actually all mental interior landscapes. And so he really felt completely fooled by the patient, and then publishes this paper. The membership paper is 1950, publishes in 1967, and I think this paper is a very, very good representation of the capacity that any of us have at being taken in by patients, and patients that are honestly self-deceived. I have a patient right now I've seen for 8 years who is in the film industry, and one of the things we discovered over the course of time is that he sees himself, he works as an editor, which means you're at the complete mercy of the director. So in the way that he sees his occupational function, he says, I'm a host for other people's points of view. If the editor has the mandate from the director that this is the way the film's supposed to look, then that's the way he's going to cut it. But the occupational hazard of doing that kind of work completely seamlessly melds with his own pathology, which is to not have much of a sense of self and then see himself as hosting other people. And so there were a number of ways in which I found in the course of the analysis that he was actually hosting me in ways that I really had to discover. For instance, in the beginning he was only coming in twice a week, and when the juncture came that we were going to discuss him coming in more often, he would say, well, I'll have to think about that. And so I would wait for him to say something about it, and then nothing would happen. And so then I realized that it was a signature way he had of saying, thank you very much, but no thank you. He didn't know how to say no. So I discovered a lot of things about him that essentially formed a language of hosting the other person, because his own sense of self was so underdeveloped that he didn't know how to make a simple assertion like, no, thank you, I don't think I want a third session. But at any rate, I think that there was something very, very courageous about Bion, the publication of this particular case study, because it really showed how trapped anybody can be by the countertransference, where you believe what you're hearing is a credible account, it sounds right, it feels right, and then you realize later on down the line that it was inauthentic in some way in which you didn't completely understand at the time. So that's a little bit something about Bion and his tremendous contributions to the understanding of countertransference. Let me just conclude all this by saying that I think that after this period of time, in 1957 is around the end of the period of time that the cohort of the three that we've been talking about ends their active explorations of psychosis. All three of them go in their own separate ways. Hannah Siegel goes in the direction of becoming a great popularizer and teacher of Klein. She writes this seminal handbook, The Introduction of the Work of Melanie Klein, which we're still reading today, published in 1964. Wrote a lot on aesthetics and literature, but really didn't do too much more with the analysis of psychosis, at least in terms of her active publications. Herbert Rosenfeld went on to a very, very distinguished, was distinguished by what he did in the psychosis period, but is probably most famous and remembered for his work on clinical narcissism. In fact, I'm giving a paper on Saturday on Rosenfeld's contributions to clinical narcissism at the UCL conference that's going to honor the contributions of Ron Britton. But he's a central contributor to the notion of narcissism. And again, just a little footnote on this, the whole analysis of psychosis is very, very strongly prefigures his interest in narcissism. Because again, remember that Freud grouped the narcissistic neuroses as an entire bunch. And from that, Rosenfeld derived the understanding of narcissism. And again, that was, you're fixated internally, your attention is turned inside, so you're relatively less concerned with the outside. It wasn't too far from that to get to the whole idea that Rosenfeld became very famous for, which is this notion that unlike the way a psychotic confuses himself and others, the narcissist instigates attacks on an object that they have deemed to have good and desirable qualities that they want to appropriate something from. So they want to have what my colleague Jim Grotstein calls bad dialysis. They want to leave the bad stuff with the object and take the good stuff with them. So that's what we think of when we think of narcissistic appropriation. Anyway, I think that Rosenfeld was very central in the development of those notions of clinical narcissism. And then, of course, Bion went on to the career that he went on to, the theory of thinking, which ironically evolves out of this period where he's working with the psychosis papers. And probably today, the single most written about analyst in the world of psychoanalysis. In the last issue of the International Journal, there's a big debate that goes on for 30 or 40 pages about, did Bion have anything substantial to contribute once he left London in 1967-68, moved to Los Angeles, where he had what some people thought of as his California period or his late period, where he went either crazy, psychedelic, mad, or had a heart attack, or a combination of all four. But basically what he produced wasn't really worth reading. And people are debating these kinds of issues today because, again, if you think some of his earlier writings are opaque, try reading his California period. Anyway, I think the hour is drawing near, so I think I'll stop there. And thank you very much for having me. It's very nice to meet you.
A complete experience within the analyst and not involving the analyst at all, and those who will be more intersubjective about it and think there's a co-creation of that projective identification. I just wondered if there's something you might if you had some thoughts on that.
Okay. Why don't we gather some comments and then we'll see where the group is, because I'd like to have a sense of hearing a number of voices before I just respond to any one particular, but have your question in mind. Anybody else? Yes.
I was wondering about what you might think about the relationship of Bion's theory of groups and his later theory.
Okay.
I'm interested in the afterlife concept that you alluded to right at the beginning, that obviously it's come to mean a vast amount of different things. But at some point, one of the ways in which it was taken was as no longer referring to a psychotic mechanism, but as being applicable, being very, the concept was usefully applicable in all sorts of other contexts to describe more normal kinds of relating. And it can start to describe any kind of mental relationship. And certainly it's been taken up in sociology in lots of different ways by certain kinds of writers. So I'm wondering if you could say anything about the point at which it might kind of escape from the circle of interest in psychosis and suddenly taken on that kind of more diffuse note. Who was it? Was it Bion's work on thinking? Was this some later point where it kind of moved away from the original purpose?
Yes.
Yeah, look, I'm a social historian, and I found it a fascinating paper, and you talk very interestingly about how these analysts were thinking about, or to what extent they were thinking about the patient's earlier history. But I felt that your account of these three figures was actually working very strongly within the kind of clinical space, but that there wasn't much social history around there. So I wonder if you're thinking kind of in a more, in terms of social context. For example, I'm fascinated to know how much these three figures were communicating with each other, or, you know, how much they see each other as rivals for Klein's attention. I mean, what would the social context, what would the story be there, and how might that relate to the different developments that are going on around Klein?
It's very interesting. Anybody else?
How the analyst starts feeling in his own body the emotions that have been projected on him. How is that mechanism?
You mean the bodily sensations that one has with patients? Okay. That's a very rich variety of comments. Okay, let's just take them in order. Theory and technique. I think it's interesting. Reminds me of something that the French neurologist Charcot once said, that theory is beautiful, but practice is better. I think that there's a real bias in the Klein group, which I haven't mentioned, that frequently a lot of seminars will start with clinical material. What your knowledge of the theory is, I think in certain ways is assumed to be secondary to the understanding of clinical material. And since the advent of the work of Betty Joseph in the last 25, 30 years, I think that's become kind of like de rigueur for the Klein group, that they generally start seminars with clinical material. Like I'm doing a presentation on Friday night, which is a transcription of 2 consecutive sessions, and it'll be gone into in great detail, because I think the assumption is that if you know how to handle the clinical interaction, that's probably as good a way of saying you're approximating an understanding of the theory. But I also think, and I think that it's one of the trajectories of my book, that as important as it is to understand what happens in the clinical consulting situation, I mean, apropos of this question that came up about the body, I think that it's also important to understand that we're also talking, in my book, there's an entire history of a very long scholarly conversation about texts. And I think it is an important idea to try and get the texts right, so that you can start to see where these ideas begin to split off. So, for instance, we can pretty textually define Klein's notion of the unconscious projection, the intrapsychic projection, as pretty much hers, and also then see Bion's elaboration of it, which is right there in his 1955 paper. And that what people have worked with from that point on have been one elaboration or another of those two basic, ideas. And I don't know many people today that just subscribe to the notion of the intrapsychic space, because it really doesn't really include the subjectivity of the analyst. And I think one of the things that's so important in the bionic expansion of it is that the subjectivity of the analyst is being included. Now, having then said that, you'll then see different intersubjective expansions of, there's the American version of projective identification, which doesn't sound anything like, anything I think a Kleinian would accept, where they, and I'm not familiar enough with it to know, but I know that the whole idea that you're co-constructing a field really, I think, starts to democratize the treatment situation in a way that I just don't feel very comfortable with. I mean, there are clear, different authoritative lines about who's the patient, who's the analyst, who's the adult, who's the infant. They can get mixed up, but I think that maybe that's a little bit over democratizing. But you can then start to look at different authors in terms of what they do to elasticize it, because I think it's a term that has a lot of cachet, so a lot of people want to appropriate it for whatever reasons, but then they wind up stretching it in different directions. To the question about the groups in this late period of thought, that's a challenge. I've been wondering lately, and I don't know, maybe Bob could help me out with this, if because Bion did have this very evolved notion of how groups function, if maybe one of the, because there's another issue of debate, like why did he leave London? There's a very poignant letter that D.W. Winnicott writes to Bion, which I thought was very generous on Winnicott's part, because one of the things that's very striking about Bion is that he rarely ever cites, I don't think he ever cites Winnicott, and it's impossible that he wasn't affected by him. But Winnicott, on the eve of Bion's leaving for Los Angeles, said, this is going to be a grievous loss for our institute if you leave London. But I've kind of wondered if Bion didn't form his own idea of what was going on in the Klein group in London at the time that made him feel like, there really wasn't much more creative growth that would be potential for him in that situation. And he was loaded down with all these administrative responsibilities, president of the society, president of the Melanie Klein Trust. One meeting after another, he really wanted to escape all that and went to Los Angeles. And, for all we know, part of what may be at stake in the whole notion of the London Kleinians thinking as a group that there isn't really much to recommend the reading of late Bion is simply because he abandoned them and left them and went to other grounds, warmer grounds, I would say. There's something to recommend California. The afterlife of a concept, fascinating question. We didn't mention this, but I think out of this period, another very, very important notion that I think is really crystallized by these papers is that it becomes axiomatic for the Klein group that there is what they call the psychotic, or some people say, in California they say there's a baby core to the personality, but I think here we say psychotogenic, that if you analyze anyone, you're going to find a psychotic core somewhere. Now, obviously, some cores are bigger than others. I think Freud even said in the Dream Book, all of us at any one given point in the day in our dreams are psychotic. I mean, we're representing things in this fantastical way that couldn't possibly be. So that's a way of saying that's a window into a psychotic aspect. Now, because Freud grouped together psychosis and perversions and narcissism, when Rosenfeld then extracted the analysis of narcissism in the 60s out of that particular template, he was going to say, as he did, that there was an aspect of the narcissistic personality that is crazy. I mean, what person goes around saying, let's see, how can I establish a relationship with you where I can appropriate as much as I can from you and give you nothing in return? I mean, that's not a proposition you can really approach too many people with, but it does seem to be an unconscious template that narcissistic personalities operate under. So the idea of the psychotic core then survives in the narcissistic state insofar as there are aspects of it that do seem pretty crazy. To the question raised by our social historian colleague, it's fascinating stuff. I had the good fortune of having lunch with John Forrester the other day. He was very interested in this whole issue of social context and who knew whom and at what time. And it is interesting. I don't know if there's any correspondence because they were all living in London at the same time. So what written correspondence there is, I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen anything. But were they competitive with one another? Gosh, that would be hard to answer. But what we do know was that Klein was obviously very capable of organizing people into a cohort group. Now, what is interesting, I think, from a social historical perspective, is that as this is going on, this movement of cohort organization amongst the Kleinians is scoffed at by people like Winnicott. Winnicott says, oh, you get these people organized under this Kleinist banner, and they just wind up producing one cliche about internal object relations after another, and there really isn't much to recommend it. But the thing that I think really hurt the independents is that they didn't organize. So you don't have the same thing happening with the independents at the time, where they would have, let's say, formed an organized cohort and say, well, we're going to take on trauma or whatever might have been an important variable to the independents, and we're going to publish a concentrated series of papers. Because I think that certainly had a lot to do with making much more of an impact than any one of those people could have made working individually. So I think that there's something to think about there. What their rivalries were with one another, that's hard to say. To the other question, which was more a technique question, how does the analyst deal with bodily sensations? I think that's a very personal issue. I mean, I don't know that I've ever really read anything about any kind of systematic data collection that's been done. I can tell you from my own experience, sometimes I do a lot of marital therapy, and probably the most emblematic thing that happens in marital therapy is people argue. Whatever the issue might be, you know, which time do I take to get to the university, and there was a half-an-hour argument that ensues from that, and you're trying to break people up. I know sometimes I'll get pains in my shoulders listening to people arguing, and then you feel like you're more like a referee in a football match trying to interrupt people. But I know that there are certain colleagues that will have like bodily reactions to talking to people. I had one colleague, a very wonderful clinician, that would start every clinical supervision the same. He would listen to a case study, and he would look around the room and say, oh, I'm in such pain. I'm in such pain. And his response was the same to every case. He'd say, oh, in my stomach I feel such pain. And so you thought, well, where are you going with this? And as it turns out, that was his central organ that he really referenced in terms of beginning to start to differentiate the material that he was listening to. Some people might orient in a very different way, but I think that that's an interesting question if, as a clinician, take that up in supervision, do you orient to patients physically? Because obviously some do more than others.
Sorry, there was something in that question about the mechanism of it. So that's tricky to address, but that's what I took you to mean. How does that actually take place? I think you can address that, and I don't expect you to be able to address that, but I think that's what you were trying to say.
Yes, it's interesting anyways, but it was how is it possible to feel in your own body as an analyst something that it's not yours? So because you are listening to some material, and then something, I mean, that's the question about the mechanism, starts to happen in your own body. So how can that be possible? You listen to something, and then you start feeling some things in your body that they don't belong to you.
I think that's a great orienting question of supervision. You know, when you're receiving a communication, and again, it goes right to the heart of what we were talking about in terms of, is the patient actually projecting something, the original definition of projective identification, into you that you then become the recipient of, that you then have to decode so that the meaning can be returned back to the patient. I think of this wonderful example from a paper by Michael Feldman, in which he had a patient turn up. He had a common waiting room, and the patient turned up after a holiday break and saw a new patient sitting in the common waiting room and assumed that it was a patient that Feldman had booked at the same time that he was seeing this patient. And so he made this seamless assumption that, oh my God, my analyst is going to be so embarrassed. He's booked 2 people at the same time. He came in, started talking about it, and then obviously the discovery was made that it was a total projection on his part. The person was just a total stranger, but it didn't mean that he had been double booked. And so the projection was fairly easily undone. What's much more complicated when we think about some of the examples we've been thinking about tonight, way on the other side of the spectrum, what if you have a patient who's in a psychotic state of mind, can't differentiate self and other, and is just projecting wildly, and then you start, as Bjorn said, you start picking up a lot of signals from the patient. Well, how do you, A, decode them, but more importantly, how do you know what belongs to the patient and what belongs to you? Not such an easy thing to do, and I think that's something that you have to then, I think, find your own personal signatures. Sometimes if I hear a show tune or something, if I'm listening to someone, I usually think that it's something of a mood is being evoked in me by a patient. I had a patient once who was a banker who talked in a kind of a monotone like this the entire session, and it's soporific. I mean, you want to sort of go to sleep. But he would talk in certain ways that made me feel especially sleepy when he would mention talking to his father on a weekly telephone call. He was very distant from his parents. He said, once I looked up on a map to try and find the antipode of where my parents lived, because I thought that's where I wanted to live. So I wanted to be as far away from his parents as possible. But there was this requisite phone call with the father every week. And he said his father was a monolinguist, and he would just carry on and on and on. And the patient would either play, like video games or, distract himself while he's listening to his father. But I found his account of that made me feel very sleepy. And it was very interesting. I listened to that experience 3 or 4 times where I just felt like, wait a minute, I had my cappuccino, I'm ready for the afternoon. And still, this man would just want to put me to sleep. And then I eventually thought, no, that must be an induced reaction I'm having listening to this patient. And I mentioned that, and I found it curious that I was feeling a little bit sleepy and I wasn't feeling that tired. And he said, that's curious. He said, I always feel sleepy when I listen to my father. No matter how much I try to distract myself, as he's carrying on his monologue, I always feel like I'm going to wind up falling asleep. And the worst thing is my fear that he's going to catch me napping on the phone. So in that instance, that was, one of those unconscious to unconscious communications where you wind up feeling it in your body. But I think it takes a bit of practice to be able to know what's really being induced in you as opposed to what might be something of your own.
Have a new raft of questions.
I wanted to pick up on your comment about the way the Kleinians sort of neglected potentially the impact of the environment. So I don't know a lot about it, but I know there's kind of evidence of sort of traumatic histories that then want to experience psychosis. And I wonder if there's, if you can say some more about if there's any been any redress there, or how Kleinian thought currently conceptualizes both the internal psychic mechanisms but also external events and the impact of them.
That's an interesting question because one of the signatures of my own research, as I discovered as I started wrapping up this monograph, is that I'm much more interested in people's collaborations than I am in their falling out. And so I wrote a chapter on Klein's collaboration with D.W. Winnicott, which lasted for many, many years. And I found as I looked in the literature, most people seem to be interested in a very, very bifurcated view, which is you read Winnicott biographers and they'll say, well, Klein really didn't give him very much, but when he hit the position of the transitional objects paper in 1952, then he's meteoric after that. Or the Kleinians that dismiss Winnicott by basically ignoring it. You can search. As a matter of fact, I searched a lot of Kleinian handbooks and found 6 references to Winnicott. I mean, this is Winnicott. So all 6 references were in the footnotes. It's stunning how he could be ignored. But they had this very intense collaboration from the mid-30s to the mid-40s, in which you have this woman who was the premier child analyst working with the pediatrician, And the question that we'll never really know much about, because there's not much correspondence with them that we haven't seen so far, is who influenced whom. Because during the time that Klein is working with Winnicott, she does an infant observation of her 3 grandchildren. And this is something I happened to find in the Klein archives a number of years ago, and I wrote a paper on it because nobody else had. And it's a 200-page, beautiful behavioral description of this infant and its mother. And you would think that this is a person that's very, very comfortable talking about environmental impact. For instance, at one point I think the grandson is about 14 months, and this is just before the war in 1938, and the parents go off for a brief holiday for a week, and they leave the grandson with Mrs. Klein. And she said, oh, he wept uncontrollably, he was inconsolable, and it was clear he was having a response to the separation. Now, the reason that that's such a profound observation is that she has Winnicott and John Bowlby in supervision with her at that time, at the time that she makes that observation. But later on, when they all wind up splitting, both Winnicott and Bowlby wind up saying, well, Winnicott made the most famous expression of this when he said, Klein had a genetic incapacity, a temperamental incapacity to understand the role of the environment. Well, from her published writings, you would certainly get that impression. But when you read these infant observations, she was very, very sensitive to the role of parental environment. But obviously, she had, an agenda that she was trying to map out. I mean, to our ears, the idea that you could approximate the states of mind that we're talking about tonight and still factor in the role of the environment, I mean, those two things go together, but at that point it was more like an oil and water sort of situation. The same thing happened with the other collaborator. She had Paula Hyman, who was the one who wrote the first paper on countertransference, who had this idea of something being induced in the animals by the patient. There was some kind of an unconscious to unconscious communication. And Klein really officially wouldn't subscribe to this idea because she was too worried about analysts just simply going on their own feeling states about what the patient was projecting into them, and she thought that might be an argument for laziness. Any random associations? Yes?
I was just thinking, in a way, I suppose one of the reasons why Bion got into this communication was his experience in groups. Any ideas about that?
Yes, this came out of just reading in sequence his papers on groups and his papers on psychosis. And what I saw is the period from 1948 to 61, where he publishes that group of paper, Experiences in Groups. He intertwines. He writes a paper on psychosis, he writes a paper on groups. And it tacks back and forth. And so I thought, well, maybe there was some other meaning for his being able to do that. And one of the things I think that makes some of these notions a little bit understandable in a different way is that he was thinking about, and this is what we spent our time talking about tonight, the psychotic state of mind, how the psychotic can attack himself and then attack the analyst in his communication. But then, what does that individual look like when you put him in a group? And so he evolves that notion of basic assumption groups, that there is something of an unconscious, irrational mentality in all groups that's going to surface in characteristic forms. Now, the thing that I found so riveting about those contributions was that he said he did not think the way Folks did of a collection of people as all discrete individuals that are all projecting onto him in the figure of a group analyst. He says, no, there's a group mind, and the projections that each person makes to what will ultimately register in the analyst's mind as the group projection, he says, are a function of anonymous contributions, which is a lovely phrase. In other words, I mean, as an analyst, if you've ever had a group or a therapist with a group, you can't sit there and say, what is so-and-so projecting onto me? I mean, you'll miss the whole flow of what's going on. You have to get more of the flow of what's happening in the group and have some sense that maybe there's a need for the leader to be a messiah or a doctorly authority or a particular sort of a role. But those contributions that each individual makes, they make anonymously. So he was saying he wouldn't be able to decipher one from the other. And I think that those kinds of experiences, I think experientially gave him a footing that the others didn't have because they were all just doing individual analysis. And I think it made him feel a little bit more confident about what it was he was receiving that he could read out as the countertransferential impact. So I think that there's a lot more to be said about being able to sort of weave back and forth between the psychosis papers and the group papers to understand how it was that he was able to evolve these notions that were really just so far ahead of its time that really, I think, in certain respects, we're still trying to catch up with what he did back in the 60s. Yes.
I wonder, can you comment about the autistic children with projective education? Do they have the capacity to have this internal mechanism? Because some people might say there's no mind in autistic person. And if there's no mind, then how could this happen?
Right, right. Yeah, I think that really your question, I think, is kind of at the cutting edge of, I think there's some people in London working on this whole notion of how to integrate autistic states of mind with some of the Kleinian notions that we're talking about. There's a person at our institute, Judith Matroni, who's written a lot on psychogenic autism. And it's true when you have an autistic patient, it's an animal of a different kind. Because the patients that we're talking about, like let's say the narcissistic patients that withhold themselves or attack in this kind of aggressive and appropriating way, are difficult to treat. But autistic patients, I think, are different insofar as they are, withheld within. The mind is a much different animal to try and access. I have the fortune right now to have an Asperger's patient in analysis with me, and it's a very interesting experience. Actually, apropos of the comment you were making about bodily experiences, one very signature experience I've had with this man over and over again is that he'll come, he'll talk, and he leaves, and I feel completely stripped of all feeling. I feel just like lifeless. And I thought, good God, what is that? I mean, that's something I hadn't quite experienced. And I've experienced it a number of times, and I felt a bit encouraged when I read, it's a Swiss analyst who works with nothing but autistic patients. She says she has to go get a physical massage twice a week to rub the feeling back into her body because she feels that there's like the life force is just literally being drained out of you because there's so much other kinds of software you have to bring to that situation. So I think it is interesting to think about what makes those patients different that induces that kind of experience. But this is a relatively new experience for me, so I'm just sort of learning as I'm going along.
Yeah, can I continue a little bit? Because once I worked with the autistic, with the Vincent, and I just did very little thing, like put my hand on his shoulder, and then later I experienced a huge somatic, like I feel I wanted to vomiting, and then over the weekend, and then when I brought that to supervision, my supervisor also feel that, so it's very huge, and then so until now, it's like a few months later, I still don't understand what's. How could that get into me?
Yes, yes. Well, I think one thing, you have to take those kinds of experiences very seriously when you have them because they'll feel very strange and very eruptive. But I think it's very important to say, well, I have felt something. I don't know how to understand the origins of that kind of experience. But I think that when you feel something that strongly, it's certainly a sign that you need to pay attention to it. Because again, how those things get communicated is very interesting. Just a historical footnote, way back in the beginning, because I know all of you are going to have a chance to probably see this new film that's coming out, that films tend to come out a little bit sooner, especially in Hollywood. This new film called The Dangerous Method, which is the story of Jung and Freud. And there's a lot of talk in the film about the experience of paranormal phenomena and how they get communicated. And at least stereotypically, Freud is known as, the ultra-rationalist, saying, well, when Jung heard the report from behind the bookcase in Freud's study when they had their monumental 13-hour conversation, Freud dismissed it as well. It was probably the radiator cracking. It was a rational explanation, but Jung said that these paranormal phenomena happen to him all the time. And what we've now found out is, because we have access to the correspondence between Freud and all these different disciples, was while he was saying these kinds of things to Jung to his face, he was then asking his other disciple, Ferenczi, to set up meetings with mediums and table turners to find out, well, maybe he's on to something. But we don't want to let him know about that, because there was a lot of interest in the whole notion about how thought could be transferred from one person to another without there being any kind of conscious mediating mechanism. So I think, again, we're at the frontier of that with autistic patients, because I think that whole issue about how communication happens in that unconscious to unconscious way is something that I think we're learning a lot about.
I think it's a shame that information collected from, not collected from the physical transference from people with autism could be used in a different way, because if it was collected, we might actually get a bigger insight through using that, what's going on inside for them. Because I don't think it would be collected because it would be used in supervision.
That's an interesting point. Well, I think in certain respects, that sounds like a worthy project, actually, to think about some systematic collection of therapeutic countertransference experiences working with autistic patients, because we might be able to do some sort of more sophisticated analysis in terms of what are the typical kinds of experiences that could be induced by working with those sort of patients. I think that would be very interesting.
Maybe one short, or two short and one long question.
Well, you said so much about the clinical component and historical, and you've already answered the question I was going to ask about Paula Heinemann. But I'm just wondering, following what Mike Roper was saying about the relationships between Rosenfeld, Bion, and Seidel, and whether Heinemann's paper on countertransference actually might then have led in that kind of construct to a disenfranchising from the Klein group in some kind of way. And I just wondered, is there something historical about that you know of that you could comment on, and also the other supplementary would be, where was Melita Schmidt?
I think she was she in New York at that time? I don't think so. Interesting question. I know that there's this one supervisee of clients who's still alive in Paris, James Gamble, who's written a little bit about this, who, according to Gamble, who was in supervision with Klein at the time that Heinemann wrote that paper, said that Klein really tried to dissuade Heinemann from giving this paper at the IPA Congress, I think it was in Zurich or Geneva, that summer of 1949. And again, what exactly were the stakes of that, we don't really know. She had been in a very, very long analysis with Klein, 16, 17 years at that point, and there was some exchange of letters, I think, in which she said, do you expect me to be under your shadow forever? Reminds me of what Jung actually said to Freud. He says, how did the student repay the teacher by remaining the student? Quoting Nietzsche. And so I think, she clearly wanted to have something of her own contribution, and she obviously had made monumental contributions during the controversial discussions. And why it would have been that Klein would have taken particular exception to this particular paper is really, I think it's really hard to say. Maybe Bob might be able to comment on it, but it was really the beginning of where they went their own way. Because again, on the face of it, you know, why would Klein have to have split with Winnicott? You know, he wants to emphasize, as he does after he does the evacuation studies in Oxfordshire, you know, the whole notion of the environmental mother, you know, having something to do with what happens to the adjustment of a child, which again, it's a commonplace thing for us to assume these days, but why that would have been something that they would have had words about and had to break over doesn't make much sense, but in context, of course, those arguments are always quite different.
So, Bob, final question.
Oh, I was going to say something probably completely irrelevant. But I was interested in just going back to the point about the Kleinians not taking an interest in the external world. This is a piece of mythology which may have a core of some truth in it, not a lot. And then the characteristics of these analyses of psychotics, who are people who, as you were saying, are so narcissistic they don't take much notice of the external world. What's the status of that kind of fit, I wonder?
Well, I think, to try and answer that question in context, well, first of all, I think there was something very riveting about trying to do this, launch this grand experiment of approximating or trying to understand what psychotic states of mind were. Because one of the things that I think is I think hard about coming to Klein, because I remember the first Kleinian text I ever read was the Hannah Siegel text on Introduction to Melanie Klein, and I thought, this woman is crazy or I'm crazy. The ideas just seemed so wild. And it was years before someone said, well, you know, she's approximating states of mind that are the most removed from our adult conscious ways of being. So if you think about infantile states of mind, psychotic states of mind, they're, unless we're traveling down those roads, are going to be the things that we're going to feel as the most foreign to our own conscious adult experience. But I think they were so caught up in it that, you know, they wound up being, in essence, the facilitating environment because they wound up receiving it. But then it wasn't too long after this that Bion comes up with this notion of container-contained, which I think is a distillation of, or his reading of Winnicott, so that, you know, much more attention was being paid to the analyst as an environmental mother that facilitated, that metabolized projections, that if you get a projection from a patient that you successfully understand and you can return it back in the form of understanding, that's the equivalent of being a pretty good environmental mother. But that's just off the top of my head.
Okay. Thanks very much. One final comment. I must say it's interesting as a sort of notion of final reparation for Klein, that sort of on her deathbed she sort of announced that Claire Winnicott is now an analyst to the world. You know, suddenly one of the last things she does is she's now an analyst, I declare. And I wonder if there's something a little bit about reparation in that particular offering to the world. Now, so talking of reparation, we're going to have a huge hand in a second, but we're going to have it also for Kevin, who's done a really nice thing, which is put this on a record for us. So, if you really enjoyed the presentation, which is very rich, you might get to see it again. So, a clap for Kevin and for Joseph. Thank you.